Europe. Before the plague. Before the Black Death swept across Europe, the continent was already not exactly a paradise. Life in the 14th century was dirty, difficult, and often short. Most people were peasants, tied to the land, working from sunrise to sunset for just enough food to stay alive. There were no flush toilets, no soap as we know it, and no idea that germs even existed. Most villages were small clusters of wooden huts with thatched roofs and dirt floors. The streets were mud, or worse, especially since people dumped their waste out the window into open ditches. If you lived in a city, things weren't much better. Cities were crowded, loud, and filled with the smells of animals, smoke, human waste, and unwashed bodies. And medicine? Well, doctors believed in balancing 4 humors in your body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you got sick, they might drain your blood with leeches or give you something to make you vomit, because obviously that would balance things out. The church dominated everyday life. Almost everyone was religious, and people believed illness was a punishment from God. That meant when someone sneezed, you didn't just say "bless you" out of habit. You meant it, because illness could be spiritual, and healing might depend more on prayer than treatment. There were famines too. Just a few decades before the plague arrived, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 devastated crops across Europe. Millions died of hunger. Malnourished people became weaker, more vulnerable to any new disease. The timing could not have been worse. Politically, Europe was fragmented. There was no single authority. No WHO hotline. Every town and kingdom had its own rules, leaders, and priorities. Communication was slow. News spread by word of mouth or on horseback. That meant that when the plague came, no one saw it coming. And when they did, it was too late. In short, Europe before the plague was like a campfire built on dry grass. All it needed was a spark, and that spark was on its way. What was the Black Death? The Black Death. Even the name sounds like a villain in a horror story. But it wasn't a myth or an exaggeration. It was real. And it was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, it wiped out an estimated 25 to 50 million people in Europe, nearly 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Entire villages vanished. Cities fell into chaos, and no one understood what was happening. So, what exactly was it? Most historians and scientists agree that the Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This nasty little organism lived in the blood of rodents, especially black rats, and was spread by fleas that bit infected animals and then humans. There were actually 3 types of plague. Bubonic plague, the most famous one, named for the painful black swellings, buboes, that appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck. People also had fever, chills, vomiting, and sometimes black spots on the skin. Death often came within 2 to 5 days. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, spread through the air by coughing or sneezing. It was even more contagious and even more deadly. Septicemic plague spread through the bloodstream. Victims could die in a single day, sometimes without even developing visible symptoms. It was terrifyingly silent. Now imagine all 3 versions hitting a population that had no immune system, no antibiotics, and no understanding of bacteria. They didn't know what a germ was. Many thought it was caused by bad air. They called it miasma, evil spirits, or divine punishment for sins. And where did it come from? The plague likely originated in Central Asia, traveling westward along Silk Road trade routes and merchant ships. It arrived in Europe through port cities like Messina, Sicily, and Marseille, carried by infected rats hiding in cargo. From there, it spread rapidly through Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The terrifying part? Once it arrived in a town, it moved, fast. One day everything seemed normal. The next, people were dying in the streets. No one knew how to treat it. Many doctors refused to see patients. Priests abandoned churches. Families abandoned each other. And amid the panic, a new kind of figure began to appear, wrapped in black robes, with a strange beaked mask, wandering through the death-soaked streets. Origins: how the plague spread. The Black Death didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had a long, dark journey, one that began thousands of miles away from Europe, in the dry steppes and trade cities of Central Asia. There, in the nests of wild rodents, the bacterium Yersinia pestis had been quietly brewing for centuries. But it wasn't until the right conditions came together, rats, fleas, people, and movement, that the spark became a firestorm. It's believed the first outbreaks began in China and Mongolia during the early 1300s. As Mongol armies and caravans moved westward, so did the disease. The Mongol Empire, with its vast trade networks, including the famous Silk Road, was great for commerce and perfect for spreading deadly infections. One particularly chilling story comes from 1346, during the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Black Sea. Mongol forces, infected by plague, reportedly catapulted the bodies of their dead over the city walls, one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare. The panicked Genoese fled back to Italy by ship, unknowingly carrying the plague with them. From Kaffa to Constantinople, from Alexandria to Sicily, the Black Death hitched rides on merchant ships. Fleas hidden in wool, grain sacks, and ship rats spread it faster than anyone could imagine. The disease entered Europe through ports like Messina, Genoa, and Marseille, where people greeted travelers with open arms and were soon burying them. Once on land, the plague spread along trade routes, riverways, and major roads. Every town it touched became a new source. Markets, inns, and religious festivals, where people crowded together, became perfect hotspots. And with no knowledge of contagion or isolation, people did everything wrong. They fled cities, unknowingly, bringing the plague to remote villages. They burned incense, huddled indoors, or blamed foreigners, making things worse. The plague respected no borders, and no class. Peasants and kings, monks and merchants, all fell equally. Horses, wagons, and even pilgrims helped the disease move from city to city. Within a few years, nearly all of Europe was infected. There was nowhere to hide. In some areas, entire towns vanished. In others, the dead were so numerous that mass graves were dug, bodies piled like logs. Survivors described the air as thick with death, and the streets echoing with wailing and silence. And just when people began to ask, "Where are the doctors?" they arrived, but they weren't what anyone expected. First outbreak. Chaos begins. When the Black Death made landfall in Europe in 1347, it didn't arrive with a warning. No sirens, no news broadcasts, just ships, quietly docking in Sicilian ports, filled with sailors covered in black boils and already half dead. Within days, the plague had begun its grim march inland, and with it came chaos. At first, people didn't understand what was happening. Was it poison in the air? Was God angry? Was it sorcery? The symptoms were terrifying. Sudden fevers, vomiting, large black swellings, bleeding under the skin, and then, within a few days, death. Entire families fell sick overnight. People who were healthy at sunrise were dead by nightfall. In Messina, the authorities tried to force infected ships back to sea, but it was too late. The rats had already jumped ashore, and from there, the disease moved fast. From port to port, down merchant roads, into the heart of towns and villages. Within months, France, Spain, England, and Germany were infected. It moved faster than anyone could understand, like a wave crashing over an unprepared world. Doctors and priests, the people who were supposed to help, were often the first to die. Hospitals overflowed. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. Churches rang their bells non-stop, signaling death after death, until the sound itself became unbearable. In some towns, officials tried to quarantine infected homes. Doors were nailed shut, windows boarded up, families left to die together inside. In others, nothing was done at all. People ran from their cities, but they carried the plague with them. Wherever they went, death followed. Some tried desperate rituals. Fires were lit to clean the air. People walked through the streets beating themselves with whips, begging God for mercy. Others blamed Jews, foreigners, lepers, or anyone different, leading to horrific acts of violence and scapegoating. Even the most powerful weren't safe. Nobles, bishops, and even monarchs died. Royal courts emptied. In England, Parliament stopped meeting. In Avignon, the Pope sat between two bonfires day and night, convinced the flames would purify the air. Society began to break down. Laws were ignored. Markets closed. Parents abandoned children. Spouses left one another. Priests refused to give last rites. It became a world where fear ruled, and death was constant. And in this chaos, a new figure appeared. Clad in dark, robes, face hidden behind a long bird-like mask, carrying strange tools and a walking stick. The plague doctor had arrived. But who were they? And what exactly did they do? The role of the plague doctor. Imagine waking up each day in the middle of a pandemic, with no cure, no vaccine, and no real understanding of how disease works, and being told, "Go help everyone who's dying." That was the job of a plague doctor. And yes, it sucked. Plague doctors were hired by cities and towns, not necessarily because they were the best physicians, but because they were often the only ones willing to take the job. Many real doctors had fled or refused to treat plague victims altogether. Who could blame them? Death was almost guaranteed, so towns turned to whoever they could get. Sometimes trained physicians, sometimes barbers, monks, failed medical students, or even just guys with strong stomachs. The important thing was that someone showed up, dressed for the part. The plague doctor had several roles: treat the sick, or at least pretend to; keep records of who had died and where; conduct autopsies, occasionally witness wills, as many people died too quickly to arrange their affairs; keep the public calm, or at least give the appearance that someone was in charge. But plague doctors were also outsiders. They were often not from the towns they served. This was intentional. They were less likely to flee if they had no local ties, and if they died, well, they could be replaced. In many places, plague doctors were seen more as functionaries than healers. They were a terrifying sight, a reminder that death was nearby. When people saw that black-robed figure walking down the street, they knew someone was already dead, or about to be. And the job wasn't just hard, it was dangerous. These doctors worked in the heart of the infection, day after day, surrounded by rotting corpses, coughing patients, and piles of contaminated clothing and bedding. There was no protective gear as we know it. No gloves, no hand sanitizer, no N95, masks. Instead, they relied on superstition, strange outfits, and sheer hope. Some plague doctors tried to help. They lanced buboes, burned herbs, or applied poultices made from onions, garlic, or pigeon fat. Others did little more than show up, carry a stick, and count bodies. Regardless of what they did, the end result was often the same. The patient died, and the doctor either caught the plague or moved on to the next victim. And yet, without them, the panic would have been even worse. Just their presence gave people some shred of hope. That maybe someone cared. That maybe someone was trying. Still, if you were a plague doctor, your odds of survival were low. Your pay was never guaranteed. And if the town ran out of money, or died off entirely, you were alone. Not to mention, You had to wear that bizarre outfit, a costume that has become the most haunting symbol of the plague. But what was it really? The outfit. What they wore. You've probably seen it. The long black robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the leather gloves, and most famously, the bird-like beak mask. It's one of the most unsettling images from history. And no, it wasn't just for dramatic flair. This was the official uniform of a plague doctor. And while it looked creepy, every piece had a very serious but very wrong purpose. Let's break it down head to toe. The beaked mask. Let's start with the obvious. That long, curved beak wasn't meant to be spooky. It was basically a medieval gas mask. People in the 14th century believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease came from bad air or poisonous vapors. So the beak was stuffed with a mix of herbs and strong-smelling ingredients: lavender rose petals, cloves, mint camphor, sometimes even vinegar-soaked sponges. The idea? These scents would filter out the plague and protect the doctor's lungs. In reality, they didn't. Filter bacteria, but they probably did make the stench of death a little more bearable. The robe. Plague doctors wore long waxed or oiled overcoats, often made of heavy leather or canvas. This was their version of PPE. It covered their body from neck to ankle, meant to keep infected fluids off their skin. Think of it as a 14th century hazmat suit. If hazmat suits were boiling hot, hard to move in, and didn't actually work. Gloves and boots. Hands and feet were covered with thick leather gloves and boots, again trying to prevent contact with contaminated patients or objects. They also made it easier to handle corpses and blood without feeling, well, anything. The hat. A wide-brimmed hat, often made of black, felt or leather, completed the look. It was partly symbolic, a sign of medical authority, and partly functional. It kept the sun out of the doctor's eyes and maybe, just maybe, stopped airborne disease from falling on their head. The staff or cane. Perhaps the strangest accessory was the wooden cane. Plague doctors used it to examine patients without touching them, to lift clothing, to poke buboes, or to keep desperate people from getting too close. Some even used it to point at things so they didn't have to speak. It also made them look more official. Because nothing says, "Trust me, I'm a doctor," like smacking things with a stick. Altogether, this outfit was meant to form a protective barrier between the doctor and the dying world around them. It was primitive, yes, but in a time without germ theory, it was better than nothing. In fact, it might have slightly reduced exposure to infected fleas, just by accident, but it wasn't perfect. The materials weren't airtight. The masks had no true filters. And worst of all, these suits were reused, rarely cleaned, and often carried as much plague as they repelled. Still, to the people in the streets, seeing a plague doctor dressed like that meant one thing: death was near. Daily, life on the job. So you're a plague doctor. You wake up, put on your waxed leather coat, strap on your terrifying bird mask, grab your stick, and step out into a city that smells like death and sounds like silence. Welcome to your shift. Being a plague doctor wasn't like being a modern physician. You didn't have a clean hospital or helpful staff. You had a dying city, a notebook, a walking stick, and maybe a bottle of vinegar. Every day you walked through empty streets, passing shuttered homes and bodies piled outside doors. Bells tolled constantly. Dogs barked. Sometimes people screamed. Most of the time, it was eerily quiet. Your first stop? A house with a white X on the door, a sign that someone inside was infected. You knock, or not, enter, and are immediately hit with the stench. Sweat, blood, vomit, rotting flesh. A person lies in bed, swollen with buboes, shivering, barely able to speak. What do? You can try some basic treatments. Lancing the boils, rubbing onions or herbs on the skin, offering plague water, a mixture of vinegar, wine, and spices. Most of it doesn't work. You take notes, nod solemnly, and move on. Next, you might be called to examine a corpse and confirm it was plague, as if there were doubt. Count the dead for city records. Collect wills from the dying, sometimes written on the spot. Visit the town council to report on the outbreak's progress. Walk through neighborhoods just to be seen, to reassure or terrify the public. You might eat a meal, probably bread, dried meat, and ale, in solitude surrounded by silence. You sleep in a room far from others if you're lucky. If not, you sleep in the open, maybe near the corpses, maybe in the doctor's quarters above the quarantine yard. There is no joy in this job. You might be cursed at by grieving families. People might refuse to let you in. Others might cling to you, begging for help, for mercy, for hope you can't give. You see the same symptoms every day. You write the same grim notes. You watch children die. You walk through streets where no laughter lives anymore. Worst of all, you know you're probably next. Even with your strange outfit, you've seen dozens of doctors before you collapse, coughing blood, and dragged into the pile. Some plague. Doctors died after a few days. Others lasted months. Few survived to retirement. Those who did were sometimes blamed for the spread and driven out of town. And through it all, you keep walking. You write names. You carry your stick. You keep showing up, because if you stop, no one else will. What plague doctors actually did. When you hear the word doctor, you probably think of someone with years of training, deep knowledge, and the ability to help people heal. But in the time of the Black Death, the title plague doctor didn't necessarily mean any of those things. In fact, the job was a weird mix of clerk, mortician, body inspector, and sometimes grief counselor, all rolled into one. Their main job wasn't even to cure people, because honestly, no one knew how. Let's break it down. 1. Recording the dead. One of the plague doctor's primary duties was record keeping. Cities hired them to document the outbreak. Who was sick, who had died, where the bodies were piling up, and how many families were infected. Think of them as a one-man public health office, but without spreadsheets. Everything was handwritten with a quill, often while sitting beside the recently deceased. Witnessing wills and testaments. Because death came quickly, people often didn't have time to get their affairs in order. Plague doctors were sometimes called in to witness last wills, write down inheritances, or confirm that a dying person was of sound mind. Imagine being asked to take legal notes while someone bleeds from their eyes. That was part of the job. Attempting basic treatments despite their reputation. Most plague doctors had very little medical knowledge. Some were trained physicians, but many were not. Still, they tried. Lancing buboes. Gross, painful, rarely helpful. Applying strange poultices made from onions, vinegar, herbs, or even roasted frogs. Bloodletting to balance the humors. Burning or applying pigeon meat to the sores. Don't ask. Prescribing plague water, mixtures of wine and spices that were more placebo than remedy. These treatments weren't effective, but they were something. And when faced with certain death, people clung to anything. Quarantine monitoring. In some cities, plague doctors helped enforce quarantines. They might mark infected homes, report on violators, or help move people into plague houses. Special hospitals for the dying, which were often just holding places until burial. Moral and religious duties. Some doctors were expected to pray for the dying, offer last words, or serve as a kind of spiritual presence. Even if they couldn't heal the body, they could help the soul, or at least make it look like someone cared. What they didn't do: perform surgery, have reliable cures, understand germs, work in clean, safe environments. get paid well, if at all, stay alive very long in many ways. Plague doctors were symbols, not saviors. They were hired so towns could say, "Look, we're doing something," even if that something was walking around in a beaked mask with a stick. And yet some did their best. They showed up. They faced death when no one else would. And, in doing so, they gave people the illusion of order, in a time of pure chaos. Treatments and cures. So you're sick with the plague. You're sweating, vomiting, your armpits are swelling up like balloons, and you're pretty sure you're dying. What can a medieval doctor offer you? Well, not much. The truth is, most plague treatments were completely useless, and many were just plain weird. Back then, medicine was based on superstition, astrology, and the ancient Greek idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The goal? Keep those humors balanced, which meant doing things that sounded scientific, but were mostly guesswork with a side of horror. Here are some of the greatest and grossest hits. Bloodletting, one of the most common cures. The idea was to release the bad humors. Doctors would cut open a vein or use leeches to suck blood out. The problem? If you already had a disease that weakened your body, draining your blood didn't exactly help. Herbal poultices doctors and healers would mash up onions, garlic, herbs, and spices into a paste and smear it on the buboes, those swollen black lumps. Did it work? Not really, but at least it smelled better than the patient. Some poultices included roasted figs and butter, crushed flower petals with vinegar pigeon meat. Yes, they'd slap a dead bird onto your sores. Toad paste and snake oil. Some believed toads or snakes could draw out the poison. In one method, you'd strap a live toad to the bubo and wait for it to die, which supposedly meant it absorbed the sickness. It didn't. Burning incense and herbs, because people believed the plague came from bad air, miasma. They burned fragrant herbs, incense, or even tar to purify the space. Some wealthy folks sat between bonfires, hoping the smoke would protect them. Spoiler, it didn't. Plague water and other elixirs. Plague water was a popular drink, a mixture of wine, herbs, and sometimes gold flakes. It was sold as a cure-all, but was really just a medieval energy drink. Some potions included crushed emeralds, powdered pearls, or even unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk and extremely expensive. Avoiding bad smells, people carried pomanders, little scented balls filled with spices, or wore masks stuffed with roses, mint, and cloves to ward off the plague. Others simply walked around holding oranges or handkerchiefs to their noses. Vinegar and rosewater baths. Some bathed in vinegar, believing it had purifying powers. Others scrubbed with rosewater or alcohol. These were slightly more helpful. At least they involved some cleanliness. But they weren't cures. What they didn't do: wash hands, quarantine early, understand how the disease spread, use antibiotics because they didn't exist, separate infected fleas and rats from people. In the end, none of these cures really stopped the plague. Some may have helped a little by improving hygiene or comfort, but most were based on fear, guesswork, or pure desperation. And when the cures failed, people turned to blame, religion, and punishment, setting the stage for some of the darkest chapters in plague history. Transition to Section 10. Public panic and superstition. Public panic and superstition. When a disaster hits and science has no answers, people turn to something older, something deeper: fear and superstition. And during the Black Death, panic spread faster than the plague itself. Imagine waking up in a town where 1 out of every 3 people is dead or dying. Your neighbors are gone. The churches are full of corpses. The doctors are covered in birds, masks, and muttering prayers, and no one knows why it's happening. In the absence of real knowledge, people came up with their own explanations. and they weren't always pretty. Bad air, miasma, burn herbs, light fires in the street, walk around with flowers jammed in your nose. Astrology? Many believed the plague was caused by an unlucky alignment of planets. In 1345, astrologers claimed that Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had formed a deadly triangle. People genuinely believed the stars had cursed the earth. God's punishment? One of the most common beliefs. The plague was seen as divine wrath for the sins of humanity. Priests preached that society had grown corrupt and immoral, and the plague was the reckoning. This belief led to waves of intense public repentance. People marched through the streets, whipping themselves, chanting prayers, begging for forgiveness. These were the flagellants, men, and sometimes women, who believed that if they suffered enough, God would spare them. They walked barefoot, wore robes, and beat themselves with iron-tipped whips, bleeding openly as crowds watched in silence or joined in. Sometimes they were welcomed. Sometimes they spread the plague even further. Magic and curses? Yes, those too. People blamed witches, sorcerers, and cursed wells. Others believed evil spirits or demons walked the earth, sowing sickness. Scapegoats? When fear turned into rage, communities looked for someone to blame. Jewish communities were frequently accused of poisoning wells or casting spells. This led to horrific pogroms, where entire neighborhoods were burned, looted, or massacred. Not because of evidence, but because people were terrified and looking for an enemy. The same happened to lepers, the disabled, travelers, even the poor. Anyone who looked different, acted strange, or simply wasn't from around there could be labeled a threat. Doctors are killing people. Yes, even plague doctors were sometimes blamed. People saw them enter homes, and within days, everyone inside was dead. Rumors spread that doctors were bringing the disease, not trying to cure it. So not only were plague doctors in constant danger from the disease, they also risked being attacked by the very people they were trying to help. In this climate of confusion, chaos became normal. Markets closed, churches filled with coffins, towns barred their gates, friends stopped speaking, families split, and, all the while, the sky above remained quiet. No answers, no rescue, no cure. It was, in every sense, a world turned upside down. Death tolls and desperation. The numbers are staggering. By the time the Black Death burned its way across Europe, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people were dead. That's 1 out of every 3 Europeans, gone in just a few short years. In some regions, the death toll was even higher, closer to 60 or 70%. But the plague didn't just kill people. It emptied cities, collapsed economies, and rewrote daily life. Whole villages were abandoned. Farmlands went untilled. Churches ran out of priests. The sheer scale of death broke the rhythm of the world. In Florence, Italy, the chronicler Boccaccio wrote of people dying so quickly that neighbors didn't bother removing the bodies. In some streets, corpses were stacked like firewood. Bells tolled constantly, not for prayer, but to announce another death. Eventually, people stopped ringing them. In London, so many people died that the city created mass burial pits, known as plague pits. Priests would bless the dead as they were dumped in, cartload after cartload, wrapped in sheets or naked, nameless. By the end, there weren't enough people left to bury the rest. In Paris, it was said that 800 people died per day at the peak. In Avignon, the Pope consecrated the entire Rhone River, so people could throw bodies into it and still be properly buried. For many survivors, the horror wasn't just the death. It was the abandonment. Families locked each other in rooms. Mothers left their sick children. Fathers vanished. People stopped helping. Everyone was afraid. The impact was so massive that entire systems failed. Trade halted. No goods, no ships, no markets. Farms collapsed. There were no workers to harvest or plant. Prices soared, then crashed. First, things became unaffordable. Then, there was no one left to buy them. Labor became scarce. And for the first time in centuries, peasants gained leverage, if they survived. Food shortages, hunger followed, the plague like a shadow. Schools closed, no teachers, no students, just silence. For those who lived through it, the plague wasn't just a disaster, it was the end of the world as they knew it. Some responded with despair, others with wild parties, many with prayer or violence. But everywhere, people were desperate. Not just for healing, but for meaning. And while some turned inward, others were literally locked away from the world, living in quarantine. Long before anyone knew what a virus was, people still understood one terrifying truth. Whatever this sickness is, it spreads. And as the plague tore through cities and villages, medieval governments and townsfolk tried one of the few tools they had: quarantine. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, which referred to the period of isolation enforced on ships arriving at Venetian ports. If you came from a region known to have the plague, your ship had to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could come ashore. It was crude, yes, but sometimes it worked. On land, though, things were much worse. So what did quarantine look like in the 14th century? Picture this. Your neighbor falls ill. A white or red X is painted on their door. A guard is posted outside. That house is now sealed. No one gets in. No one gets out. The family inside is left to either recover or die. Food might be delivered to the doorstep, if someone was generous. Otherwise, people inside relied on what they had. The sick and the healthy were locked in together, meaning entire families were lost when only one person was infected. At first, in wealthier cities, full plague houses or pest houses were created. Isolated buildings where the infected were sent. These were overcrowded, filthy, and terrifying places, often with more rats than medicine. Some people were dragged there by force, screaming and kicking. Others simply disappeared and were never heard from again. Quarantine by class. The poor were often forced into plague houses or locked in slums. The wealthy sometimes fled the cities early, to country villas, monasteries, or private manors, taking servants, and sometimes the plague, with them. If you were a merchant, your goods might be confiscated or burned. If you were a traveler, you might be turned away at the gates or killed on sight. Many towns sealed their gates completely, cutting themselves off from the outside world. No trade, no visitors, no way in or out. This protected some places, but for others, it only delayed the inevitable. Inside quarantine. It was lonely, boring, frightening. People sang hymns, told stories, cried, or went completely silent. Priests and plague doctors might come by with food or last rites, but often, no one came at all. Some families tied rags soaked in vinegar over their windows, hoping to purify the air. Others burned herbs inside or prayed for visions. Many simply waited for the sickness to reach them. And if you tried to escape, there were punishments, beatings, jail, or death. Because once a quarantine was declared, breaking it was seen as a crime against the community. People were so afraid of contagion that even survivors were shunned. Those who recovered were often treated as lepers, marked by the fear that they still carried something. In the end, quarantine wasn't a cure, but it showed something important. Even in a time of panic and ignorance, people still tried. They isolated, they adapted, and sometimes they survived. Still, for many, faith in isolation gave way to faith in other things: flagellants, priests, and false prophets. When the world feels like it's ending, people look for answers. And when doctors, rulers, and logic fail, they turn to something older: faith, or at least something that looks like it. During the Black Death, organized religion was everywhere. The church dominated life in Europe. People were baptized, married, and buried under its watch. But the plague broke that system. Priests died. Churches shut down. Last rites couldn't be given. Mass burials became the norm. For many, it felt like God had abandoned them. This spiritual vacuum opened the door to extremes, and into that vacuum marched the flagellants, the flagellant movement. The flagellants were religious zealots who believed that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, and that the only way to stop it was through public penance. So, what did they do? They marched from town to town, often in groups of 50 to 500 people, dressed in robes, hoods, or sometimes just bare-chested. As they walked, they whipped themselves bloody with metal-tipped scourges, in the streets in front of crowds chanting hymns and prayers. Their message was simple: repent, and maybe God will stop the plague. At first, people welcomed them. In towns where plague doctors had vanished and leaders had no plan, these flagellants seemed like holy warriors. But over time, things grew darker. They began preaching anti-clerical messages, rejecting the authority of the Pope. Some blamed Jews and heretics, spreading violence and fear. Others acted as though they were immune to the plague, until they weren't. Eventually, the church declared them heretics, and many groups were banned or scattered. But their impact lingered. They showed how fear could be weaponized, and how quickly desperation could turn into fanaticism. Priests and monks. Not all religious leaders disappeared. Many priests stayed, risking their lives to deliver last rites, comfort the dying, and bury the dead. Monasteries became shelters. Some clergy died in droves, choosing faith over survival. Others, however, fled. Some towns had no priest left at all. In places like Avignon, the center of the Catholic Church at the time, the Pope tried to take action, including blessing rivers for mass burials and lighting bonfires for purification. But there was only so much he could do. The Church's reputation suffered. If holy men were dying like everyone else, or worse, running away, then what power did they really have? False prophets and apocalypse preachers. The chaos also attracted another kind of figure, the doomsayer. Men and women began proclaiming that the plague was a sign of the end times, that Judgment Day was here. Some claimed they had received visions from God, others that they could cure the plague with special relics or secret prayers. For a price, of course. Some led peaceful pilgrimages. Others incited mobs. A few gathered followers and vanished into the countryside, waiting for the world to end. None of them stopped the plague, but they offered something people needed: someone to follow. In this crisis of faith, people either became more devout, turning to prayer and sacrifice, or more hopeless, giving in to despair, indulgence, or violence. And in the chaos left by empty pulpits and broken altars, blame began to take a more dangerous form. Blame games, scapegoats, and witch hunts. When disaster strikes and no one understands why, people look for someone to blame. During the Black Death, with no science, no cures, and no real hope, fear turned into rage, and that rage turned on the innocent. All across Europe, communities began searching for scapegoats, and tragically they found them. Blaming the Jews, one of the darkest chapters of the plague, was the wave of anti-Semitic violence that swept across Europe. People accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells, casting curses, or conspiring to destroy Christian society. These accusations were baseless, but they spread fast. In some cities, entire Jewish neighborhoods were wiped out. Men, women, and children were dragged into the streets and burned alive, drowned, or executed in public squares. In Strasbourg, over 1,000 Jews were burned in a single day. In Mainz, Cologne, and other cities, organized massacres were carried. out with the silent approval of local leaders. Why the Jews? Because they were different. They dressed differently, spoke differently, and often lived in tight-knit communities. And because they were already marginalized, they were easy targets. Their supposed immunity, many Jewish communities had better hygiene practices, made people even more suspicious. Some kings and the Pope condemned the violence, but by then, the blood had already been spilled. Blaming lepers, beggars, and outsiders Jews weren't the only ones blamed. So were lepers. People with skin diseases were accused of spreading the plague on purpose. Many were rounded up and killed. Beggars, seen as dirty, sinful, and suspicious. Foreigners or travelers. If you weren't from town, you were automatically suspect. Women, especially healers or midwives, were sometimes labeled as witches, blamed for cursing their neighbors. In times of terror, people stopped seeing humans and started seeing threats. Mob justice fear made people brutal. In towns across Europe, mobs formed to carry out justice without trials or evidence. Torches were lit. Wells were sealed. People were tortured into confessing crimes they never committed, just to stop the pain. This was a world unraveling, where logic no longer mattered. If enough people believed something, it became true. The irony, the real culprit, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, continued spreading quietly, riding on the backs of rats and fleas. While people murdered each other in the streets, the plague kept doing its job and didn't care who got blamed. Blame gave people a feeling of control, a way to channel fear into action, but it also led to some of the worst atrocities of the pandemic. Cruelty born from confusion. And in the aftermath, even as bodies were buried and mobs disbanded, cities and communities would never be the same again. What happened to the cities? When the plague finally passed through, it didn't leave towns the way it found them. It left behind ghost cities, once bustling marketplaces now filled with silence, broken carts, and boarded-up doors. Entire streets stood empty, the walls still stained from the marks of death. In many places, there were more graves than people. So what actually happened to Europe's cities after the Black Death? 1. Depopulation. The most obvious change was numbers. Some towns lost half their population. Others lost even more. Villages were so thoroughly emptied that they were abandoned forever. Fields overgrew. Homes collapsed. Whole regions simply disappeared from the map. In England alone, it's estimated that over 1,000 villages vanished. Just gone. Labor shortages. With so many dead, there simply weren't enough people to do basic jobs. Farms went untended. Markets had no goods. Trades like blacksmithing, tanning, and cloth-making stalled. But here's where things got interesting. For the survivors, especially the poor, this created opportunity. Workers became valuable. Landowners, desperate for labor, offered better pay, better living conditions, and even freedom from serfdom. In many places, this began to shift the balance of power, from the nobles to the people. The feudal system, where peasants were tied to the land and lords, began to crack. Economic collapse. Then boom at first, the plague wrecked economies. Trade stopped, crops rotted, coins lost value. But over time, a strange thing happened. With fewer people, resources stretched further. Survivors inherited land, tools, and wealth. Wages rose, prices adjusted. Some cities actually became richer per capita than before the plague. In other words, yes, it was a disaster, but it planted the seeds of social change. Architecture and urban space cities physically changed too. In some places, plague pits were later turned into memorials or sacred grounds. Some areas were rebuilt from scratch, with better drainage, wider streets, or new sanitation measures. New cemeteries were established outside city walls to prevent future contamination. In other areas, the destruction was never repaired. Buildings remained boarded up or collapsed, left as silent monuments to what had happened. Cultural impact: art, writing, and religion shifted in tone. People became obsessed with death and judgment. Skeletons danced in murals. Priests preached fire and brimstone. Tombstones bore images of rotting bodies instead of angelic figures. And yet some celebrated life more fiercely than ever, throwing lavish parties, spending inherited fortunes, and chasing pleasures they'd once feared. The cities of Europe emerged from the plague not just changed, but transformed, socially, economically, spiritually, and architecturally. But for one strange group, this transformation was even more literal, because despite all the horror, plague doctors somehow survived in paintings, masks, legends, and pop culture. Plague doctors in art and pop culture. Of all the grim images to come out of the Black Death, mass graves, weeping statues, burning cities, none is more enduring than the plague doctor. That beaked mask, the black robe, the silent walk with a wooden cane, it became the face of the plague, then of fear, then of something else entirely. Myth. Today, plague doctors appear in Halloween costumes, video games, horror movies, tattoos, and memes. But how did we get from a half-trained medieval doctor to a pop culture icon? Let's trace the strange journey. The real doctors versus the iconic image. Historically, plague doctors came in all shapes, some trained, some not. The iconic look, black robe, bird mask, leather gloves, didn't become standardized until the 17th century, particularly in Italy and France, long after the first wave of the Black Death. The most famous version came from Charles de Lorme, the physician to King Louis XVIII. His design was meant to be practical: waxed coat, glass eye covers, and a long beak filled with herbs. But it looked terrifying, especially to peasants who had no idea what it was. Soon, people weren't just afraid of the plague. They were afraid of the doctors, too. Satire and dark comedy. By the 1600s, plague doctors became the butt of jokes in European plays and street theater. In Italian Commedia dell'arte, a masked character called Il Medico della Peste mocked the doctor's arrogance and cluelessness. Imagine a stiff, masked figure offering ridiculous advice, tripping over his robes, poking people with a stick. It became dark comedy, a way for people to laugh at fear. This mix of real tragedy and absurdity stuck. The plague doctor became a symbol of the useless expert, the morbid messenger, or the fool in the face of death. Art and symbolism. Painters used plague doctors to symbolize death, fear, and human helplessness. In dance, macabre art, those skeletons dancing with kings and peasants. You might spot a plague doctor in the background, a reminder that no one escapes death. Some artists portrayed them as grim reapers, others as tragic heroes trying to help in vain. Over time, the mask became a metaphor, not just for disease, but for everything unknowable and uncontrollable. The Gothic revival and Halloween fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and plague doctors started appearing in Gothic horror stories, costumes, and eventually, pop culture. Their eerie design, featureless eyes, a bird's beak, and silence, fit perfectly with spooky aesthetics. Today, you'll find them in video games like Assassin's Creed or Bloodborne comics, and webtoons as mysterious figures, or Dark Guardians cosplay and Halloween costumes. Memes, especially during COVID-19, where the mask took on a whole new layer of irony. Why it stuck. The plague doctor represents more than just a doctor. They're a symbol of fear in human form. Not evil, not heroic. Just a person doing a terrible job in a terrible time, wearing a mask because they had nothing else. That's why they're unforgettable. They walked through cities where death ruled, holding nothing but a stick, a notebook, and a face that wasn't even their own. And now, Centuries later, they've outlived the plague, not in body, but in memory, myth, and mask. Why it was so dangerous to be one? Let's be honest, being a plague doctor wasn't noble, glamorous, or even remotely safe. It was one of the worst jobs in history. Dangerous, disgusting, and in many cases, deadly. So why did anyone take it? Simple. Money, pressure, or desperation. The risks were everywhere. Every single day on the job, a plague doctor faced direct contact with infected patients, exposure to blood, pus, vomit, and breath, entering homes soaked in disease, handling bodies without proper sanitation, wearing the same unwashed outfit day after day, constant risk of being attacked by mobs, blamed for deaths, or caught in riots, and there were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no gloves, no hand-washing protocols. They didn't even fully understand how the disease spread. So every time they touched a patient, a blanket, or a doorknob, they were gambling with their life. The beaked mask and leather robe might have helped a little. The waxed fabric offered a small barrier against fluids, and the herbs in the mask filtered out some of the stench. But it wasn't real protection. Most plague doctors still got sick. Some died within days. Others lasted weeks or months. A lucky few survived and moved on to the next outbreak, only to face it all over again. The pay. Sometimes, but not always, cities hired plague doctors, and sometimes promised good pay. A salary, housing, maybe even bonuses if they stayed until the end of the outbreak. But here's the problem. If the town ran out of money, or everyone died, you probably didn't get paid. Many plague doctors died broke. Their families left with nothing. Others were hired from outside the city and weren't allowed to leave. They were quarantined, just like the patients. Some weren't even allowed to go home if they survived. People feared they were carriers of the plague and refused to let them back into their villages. Some were hated, not honored plague. Doctors were often mistrusted. People blamed them when entire households died. In times of panic, they were chased out, stoned, or even killed. To many, their arrival meant only one thing: death was in the house. And if they were outsiders, which many were, they had no protection, no allies, and no legal power. Just a stick and a terrifying costume. And the mental toll? Imagine this: watching children beg for help. You can't give writing down names of the dead while flies land on your notebook. Hearing screams from behind sealed doors sleeping in. A room above a plague pit. Wondering every single day, is today the day I get it too? Some doctors broke down. Others gave up. A few stayed strong, but no one came out of the job unchanged. In the end, the plague doctor wasn't a hero or a villain, just a symbol of survival in a time of death. A person trying to do a job no one wanted, in a world falling apart, and yet, somehow, they became one of the few things people still remember from the darkest time in history. Did anything actually work? So after all the horror, the herbs, the fires, the bloodletting, the vinegar-soaked sponges and dead pigeons, the big question is, did anything actually work? Surprisingly, yes, but not in the way people thought. Quarantine, when done properly. The most effective thing people did during the plague, even without understanding germs, was isolation. When towns enforced strict quarantines, especially early in an outbreak, they sometimes managed to slow or even stop the spread. In Venice, ships had to wait 40 days in port before unloading. 40 giorni, quarantine. Some cities walled themselves off entirely, closing gates, banning travelers, and posting guards. Plague houses, though horrifying, kept sick people separated from the healthy. It wasn't perfect. People broke rules, rats still snuck through, and enforcement was inconsistent. But in terms of real results, Quarantine was one of the few medieval responses that actually helped, purely by luck and observation, not science. Fleeing, if you did it early enough, the wealthy had a saying, "Cito, long, tarde." Leave, quickly, go far, return late. Translation? Run like hell. People who fled cities before the plague arrived often survived. The rich escaped to country villas, isolating themselves away from population centers. Once the plague hit your town, though it was usually too late. Ironically, fleeing also helped spread the disease, as infected people carried it with them. But for individuals who timed it right, escaping could mean the difference between life and death. Cleanliness, even if accidental. Medieval people didn't know what hygiene meant the way we do today, but certain habits did make a difference. Jewish communities, who bathed more frequently and followed strict cleanliness rituals, had lower infection rates in some places, which tragically led to suspicion and persecution. People who washed clothes, aired out rooms, or burned bedding sometimes reduced flea populations. Simple habits like avoiding corpses and not sharing food helped, even if unintentionally. Natural immunity and genetics. Some people just didn't get sick. Today, scientists believe certain individuals had genetic resistance to Yersinia pestis. Their immune systems responded faster, or their blood chemistry made it harder for the bacteria to thrive. These survivors passed down those traits, which may explain why some towns had unusually high survival rates. Time and natural die-off. Eventually, the plague burned through populations so thoroughly that it ran out of fuel. Once a town was mostly dead, or immune, the disease moved on. It wasn't a victory. It was exhaustion. In some cases, changing seasons also helped. Fleas don't thrive in cold weather, so winter slowed transmission. The plague returned, in waves, but each wave found fewer victims. What didn't work? Bloodletting, burning incense, drinking potions, wearing charms, praying by itself, magical thinking, flagellation, slapping pigeons on your sores. Seriously, don't do this. The takeaway. The things that worked, quarantine, distancing, hygiene, were mostly accidents. The things that didn't work were loud, painful, and popular. It would take centuries before science finally caught up. But the lessons learned during the Black Death laid the groundwork for public health, sanitation, and epidemic control in future centuries. What happened to the plague doctors? They came, quietly. They walked the streets with long black robes, masks like birds, and sticks in hand. They counted the dead. They faced the sick. They tried to help, or at least tried to appear as if they were helping. But when the plague faded, what happened to the plague doctors? The answer? Most of them disappeared, into the dirt, into rumors, or into forgotten records. Many didn't survive. Let's be clear, a lot of plague doctors died on the job. Even with their beaked masks and oiled robes, the risks were overwhelming. They worked in the middle of infection, surrounded by dying patients, contaminated homes, and corpses. With no knowledge of germs and no real protective gear, infection was almost inevitable. There are no solid numbers, but historical accounts often mention plague doctors who served until their own death. Some lasted weeks, others days. A few, through sheer luck or isolation, survived. Some were abandoned or forgotten. Plague doctors were often outsiders, hired from other cities or regions. That meant when their contract ended, or their town died, they had no home to return to. In some cases, they weren't allowed back at all. People feared they carried the disease and treated them like the infected. Those who survived might have ended up homeless, jobless, sick, or simply lost to history. Many were never paid, especially if the town's leadership died or finances collapsed. Some left behind unclaimed families or widowed spouses. There were no medals, no thank you plaques, no pensions. A few became legends, while most plague doctors faded into obscurity. A few became semi-famous, either for surviving or for writing about their experience. For example, Matteo Boiardo, Italy, kept notes on his patients and is occasionally cited in medical texts. Nostradamus, the famous seer, claimed to have treated plague victims and recommended cleanliness and fresh air, which, oddly enough, was better advice than most of his peers. Charles Delorme, personal doctor to French royalty, designed the famous beaked costume used in later outbreaks, but most didn't write books. They didn't have time, or energy, or the luxury of survival. The disappearance of the profession. As medicine advanced and understanding of disease improved, the plague, doctor profession faded away. By the 18th century, their costume was considered outdated. The last major appearances were during smaller outbreaks in France, Spain, and Eastern Europe. Eventually, doctors wore white coats, not black robes. They used microscopes, not herbs. And the bird mask? It became part of carnival costumes, theater, and Halloween. A symbol, not a job. Remembered in fear and fiction today, plague doctors are more myth than memory. They're remembered not as great healers, but as symbols of helplessness in the face of horror. Silent witnesses to mass death, standing in the streets with nothing to offer but presence. In a way, that's what makes them powerful. They didn't have the answers. They didn't have the tools. They just showed up when no one else would. What the plague taught us about medicine. By the time the Black Death finally loosened its grip on Europe, it had killed tens of millions, shattered societies, erased towns, and left entire generations traumatized. But strangely, it also changed the world, because when the dying stopped, the learning began. It exposed the limits of medieval medicine. The plague revealed the truth. Doctors didn't have the tools. Priests didn't have the answers. Rituals, charms, and bloodletting didn't work. For the first time, people began to question the old systems. Why did the experts fail? Why did prayers not stop it? Why did some survive while others didn't? These questions planted the seeds of modern medicine. Slowly, over generations, people started looking for evidence, cause and effect, not just divine will or ancient beliefs. It sparked scientific curiosity. Out of the ashes of the plague came investigation. By the 16th and 17th centuries, scholars began studying the human body more directly, not just reading old texts, but dissecting cadavers, experimenting, observing. Eventually, this led to germ theory, antibiotics, vaccines, public health systems, all things the plague doctors never had, but helped inspire through their failure. It changed society and labor. Forever, the mass death caused a labor shortage so severe that peasants gained bargaining power. Wages rose. The feudal system cracked. Serfs began to demand rights, move freely, and challenge the idea that they were tied to land and lords. Some historians believe the Black Death was one of the key triggers of the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, a rebirth of thought, science, and art. It redefined death before the plague. Death was part of life. After the plague, death was everywhere, sudden, terrifying, unfair. It became an obsession in art, literature, and religion. This led to the rise of dance macabre imagery, skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike, a boom in death poetry and religious introspection, a shift in spiritual thinking, more personal, more urgent. Death was no longer distant. It lived next door, and it left behind a deeper emotional imprint on how humans viewed life itself. It taught us that, even in the darkest times, people try. They burned herbs. They built quarantine walls. They marched, prayed, and wept. Most of it didn't work, but they tried. And in the middle of it all were people like the plague doctors, half healers, half symbols, who walked straight into the heart of the dying world not because they had the cure, but because someone had to be there. Final thought, the Black Death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point, a brutal, painful awakening that forced humanity to look at itself, to learn, and to evolve. And even today, when we face pandemics, fear, and uncertainty, we still feel the long shadow of that time. We still wear masks. We still isolate. We still search for answers. And sometimes, we still joke about plague doctors, not because it's funny, but because we understand the fear behind the mask. End of script. Why it sucked to be a medieval plague doctor. Thank you for listening. May your sleep be peaceful, your air be clean, and your 14th century career options remain hypothetical.